Marcus Wellington had everything money could buy. His business empire stretched across 3 continents. His mansion overlooked the Pacific Ocean, and his name appeared on magazine covers as one of the world's youngest billionaires. But success couldn't fill the emptiness he felt every time he walked through his childhood home. The massive estate had been in his family for generations. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers and priceless paintings adorned the walls. Yet the house felt cold and lifeless, much like his relationship with his father, Richard Wellington. They barely spoke anymore, their conversations limited to business matters and polite exchanges during family gatherings. Richard had always been a distant man, consumed by work and social obligations. When Marcus's mother died 10 years ago, the gap between father and son had grown even wider. Richard threw himself into managing the family's old money, while Marcus built his tech empire from scratch, determined to prove he didn't need his father's help or approval. On this particular Tuesday evening, Marcus arrived at the estate earlier than expected. He had planned to discuss some investment opportunities with his father, but the conversation he'd imagined would be brief and formal, as always. The butler informed him that Richard was in his private study on the 2nd floor. Marcus climbed the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing in the vast hallway. Family portraits stared down at him from gilded frames, generations of Wellingtons who had built their fortune in shipping and real estate. He had always felt like an outsider among these stern-faced ancestors, preferring computers and innovation to their traditional ways. As he approached his father's study, Marcus heard something that made him stop in his tracks. The sound was so unexpected, so foreign to everything he knew about his father, that he wondered if he was imagining it. Through the heavy oak door came the unmistakable sound of weeping. Richard Wellington, the man who had never shown emotion in front of his son, the pillar of strength who had weathered business storms and personal tragedies without flinching, was crying. Deep, heartbroken sobs that seemed to come from somewhere buried so deep that Marcus had never suspected its existence. Confused and concerned, Marcus pushed the door open without knocking. The sight that greeted him shattered everything he thought he knew about his father and their household. Richard sat in his leather armchair, tears streaming down his weathered face, while Elena Rodriguez, their head maid of 15 years, held him in her arms. Elena was a woman in her early 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair that she always kept neatly pinned back. She had worked for the Wellington family since before Marcus's mother had passed away, maintaining the household with quiet efficiency and gentle warmth. Marcus had always appreciated her presence, as she was one of the few people in the house who treated him like a person, rather than just the heir to a fortune. But seeing her cradling his father like this, seeing the intimacy and tenderness between them, left Marcus speechless. This wasn't the formal relationship between an employer and employee. This was something deeper, more complex, and completely hidden from the world he thought he knew. Richard looked up through his tears, his face a mixture of shock and shame at being discovered in such a vulnerable moment. Elena's eyes met Marcus's with a calm steadiness that suggested she had been preparing for this day for a long time. Neither of them spoke immediately, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Every assumption he had made about his family, every conclusion he had drawn about his father's cold nature, every belief he held about the people closest to him was suddenly in question. The successful businessman who could navigate million-dollar deals with confidence found himself completely lost in his own home. The silence stretched on, filled with 15 years of secrets and unspoken truths. Marcus realized that his father, the man he had spent his adult life trying to understand and connect with, was a complete stranger. And Elena, who had been a constant comforting presence throughout his childhood and teenage years, held keys to family mysteries he never knew existed. As he stood frozen in the doorway, Marcus understood that this moment would change everything. The discovery would force conversations that had been avoided for years, reveal truths that had been carefully hidden, and challenge the very foundation of what he believed about love, family, and the price of keeping secrets. The sound of his father's continued weeping filled the study, a sound that would haunt Marcus long after this evening ended. He knew that whatever Elena was about to tell him would either bring his family together or tear apart the last threads holding them in their careful, distant dance around each other. Elena's hand gently stroked Richard's silver hair as she looked directly at Marcus. her expression mixing apology with determination. She had carried this burden alone for too long, and now it was time for the truth to finally come to light, no matter what the consequences might be for all of them. Elena gently helped Richard compose himself, handing him a tissue while never breaking eye contact with Marcus. The older man's hands shook as he wiped his face, decades of suppressed emotion finally breaking through the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart. "Marcus," Elena said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of carefully guarded secrets. "Please sit down. There are things you need to know, things that should have been told to you long ago." Marcus moved mechanically to the chair across from his father, his mind reeling with questions he didn't know how to ask. The study, with its mahogany bookshelves and family memorabilia, suddenly felt like foreign territory. Everything familiar had become strange in the span of a few minutes. Richard finally looked up at his son, his eyes red and filled with a pain that Marcus had never seen before. "I never wanted you to see me like this," he whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. "I've spent so many years trying to be strong, trying to be the father I thought you needed. But you weren't strong," Elena said gently, her hand still resting on Richard's shoulder. "You were broken, and you've been breaking a little more each day for 15 years. Marcus leaned forward, finally finding his voice. "What's going on? What aren't you telling me?" The questions tumbled out faster than he could organize them. "How long has this been happening? What kind of relationship do you two have?" Elena took a deep breath, her composure steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "Your father and I have been taking care of each other since your mother became ill. But not in the way you might think." She moved to the window, looking out at the garden where she had spent countless hours over the years. "When your mother was diagnosed with cancer, she asked me to do something that I've never told anyone about. She called me into her room one night about 6 months before she passed away." Richard's breathing became labored as Elena continued, the memory clearly painful for both of them. Marcus watched his father's face, seeing vulnerability there that he had never witnessed, not even at his mother's funeral. "Your mother knew she was dying," Elena continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "She also knew something that no one else in this family understood. She knew that your father was not the cold, distant man everyone believed him to be. She knew that beneath his business facade, he was terrified of being alone, terrified of showing weakness, and completely unprepared to face life without her." Marcus remembered his mother as a warm, intuitive woman who seemed to understand people in ways that others couldn't. She had been the emotional center of their family, the bridge between Marcus and his father, the one who made their house feel like a home. "She made me promise," Elena said, turning back to face both men, "that I would take care of Richard after she was gone, not just as a maid but as a friend. She said he would try to shut everyone out, that he would bury himself in work and duty, and that he would slowly disappear if someone didn't anchor him to life." Richard's hands clenched the arms of his chair, his knuckles white with tension. "She knew me better than I knew myself," he said quietly. "After the funeral, I wanted to send everyone away, to be alone with my grief and guilt." "Guilt?" Marcus asked, the word catching him off guard. "I blamed myself for her death," Richard admitted, the words coming out in a rush as if he had been holding them back for years. "I was so focused on business, so consumed with providing for the family, that I missed the early signs of her illness. I convinced myself that if I had been more attentive, more present, maybe we would have caught it sooner." Elena moved back to Richard's side, her presence clearly a source of comfort that had sustained him through his darkest period. He would sit in this room for hours, sometimes for entire days, just staring at her picture and torturing himself with what-ifs and should-haves. Marcus thought about those first few years after his mother's death, how his father had seemed to retreat further into himself, how their already limited conversations had become even more strained and formal. He had interpreted his father's behavior as indifference, never imagining the depth of pain and self-recrimination that was eating away at him. "So Elena would find excuses to bring me meals, to check on me, to force me to engage with the world," Richard continued. "She would ask my opinion about household matters that she could have handled herself, create reasons for me to leave this room, gently push me to remember that I was still alive. But tonight was different," Elena said, her voice heavy with concern. "Today marks 15 years since your mother passed away, and for the first time since her funeral, your father broke down completely. All the grief and guilt and loneliness that he's been carrying finally overwhelmed him." Marcus looked at his father with new eyes, seeing not the distant successful businessman, but a man who had been quietly falling apart for over a decade. The revelation reframed every interaction they had shared, every conversation that had felt cold or formal, every moment when Marcus had wished for more emotional connection. "Why didn't you tell me?" Marcus asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why did you both let me believe that you were just employer and employee? Why did you let me think that you didn't care about anything but business?" Richard met his son's eyes for the first time since Marcus had entered the room. "Because I was ashamed," he said simply. "I was supposed to be your father, your example of strength and leadership. How could I show you that I was barely holding myself together? How could I burden you with my weakness?" Elena shook her head sadly. He couldn't see that his pain was driving you away, that his attempt to appear strong was actually pushing his son further from him every day. Marcus sat in stunned silence, processing everything he had just learned. The image of his father as an emotionally unavailable man was crumbling, replaced by someone far more complex and wounded than he had ever imagined. But he sensed there was still more to the story, something deeper that Elena hadn't yet revealed. "There's something else, isn't there?" Marcus asked, studying Elena's face. Despite her calm exterior, he could see the tension around her eyes, the way she kept glancing at his father as if seeking permission to continue. Elena nodded slowly, her hands clasping together in front of her. "Your mother asked me to take care of your father, yes, but she also gave me something else to protect. Something she made me promise to keep safe until the right time came to share it." She moved to an antique desk in the corner of the study, one that had belonged to Marcus's grandmother. From the bottom drawer, she withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and bearing his mother's distinctive handwriting. Marcus's name was written across the front in elegant script. "She wrote this letter to you just days before she died," Elena explained, her voice trembling slightly. "She wanted you to have it, but not immediately. She asked me to wait until I felt you were ready to understand her words, until circumstances made it necessary for you to know the complete truth about your family." Richard looked away, his jaw clenched tight. Marcus realized that his father had known about the letter all these years, but had respected his wife's wishes to let Elena decide when to share it. "What kind of truth?" Marcus asked, taking the envelope with hands that weren't entirely steady. "What else could there be?" "Read it," Elena said gently. "Your mother explains it better than I ever could." Marcus carefully opened the envelope. Aware that he was about to read words his mother had written while dying, words specifically meant for him but kept secret for 15 years. The paper was fine stationery, the kind his mother had always used for important correspondence, and her handwriting was slightly shaky, showing the effects of her illness. "My dearest Marcus," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then Elena has determined that you are ready to understand some difficult truths about our family. I pray that enough time has passed for you to receive these words with wisdom, rather than anger." Marcus paused, looking up at Elena and his father before continuing. Both watched him with obvious anxiety, waiting for his reaction to whatever revelations were contained in the letter. "You have always been such a bright, perceptive child," the letter continued, "but there are things about your father and our marriage that we deliberately kept from you. Not out of deception, but out of love and protection." Marcus felt his heart rate increase as he read on. "Your father is not the cold, distant man he appears to be. His reserve, his focus on work, his difficulty expressing emotion, none of these things reflect his true nature. They are armor, my son. Armor he built to protect himself from a pain so deep that it shaped every aspect of his adult life." The letter went on to explain something that Marcus had never suspected, never even considered. His father, Richard Wellington, had not been born into the wealthy family that Marcus had always assumed was their heritage. The Wellington name, the family business, the entire foundation of their social standing, it had all come through marriage to Marcus's mother. "Your father came from nothing," the letter revealed. "His real name is Richard Kowalski, and he grew up in a working-class Polish family in Detroit. His father was an auto worker who died in an industrial accident when Richard was 16. His mother cleaned office buildings at night to support her children." Marcus read the words twice, unable to fully process what his mother was telling him. His father, the man he had always seen as the embodiment of old money privilege, had actually been born into poverty? He won a scholarship to study business, worked 3 jobs to support himself through college, and built his first successful company before he was 25. The letter continued. But he never felt worthy of the life he had created for himself. When we met, when he fell in love with me and I with him, he was terrified that my family would reject him because of his background. The Wellington family had indeed been old money, descended from shipping magnates and real estate developers. Marcus's mother, Catherine Wellington, had been the sole heir to a considerable fortune and a prestigious name. Their marriage had been a merger of Richard's business brilliance and Catherine's established wealth and social connections. So he buried Richard Kowalski, his mother's letter explained. He adopted not just my name but my family's history, their mannerisms, their way of speaking and thinking. He became so committed to being a Wellington that he lost touch with the warm, passionate man I fell in love with. Marcus looked up at his father, seeing him now through completely different eyes. The formal speech patterns, the rigid posture, the emphasis on proper behavior and social expectations. It had all been a performance, a decades-long attempt to live up to a role he had never been born to play. The tragedy, the letter continued, is that my family would have loved him exactly as he was. My parents adored Richard's intelligence, his work ethic, his devotion to me. They never cared about his background. But by the time he realized this, he had already buried his true self so deeply that he couldn't find his way back to who he really was. Elena watched Marcus's face as he read, seeing the shock and understanding dawning in his expressions. Your mother knew that after she died, your father would become even more rigid, more trapped in the identity he had created, she said softly. She worried that he would push you away completely, that you would never know the real man underneath all those layers of pretense. But why tell me this now? Marcus asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Why not years ago? Because, Elena replied, your father is finally ready to stop pretending. Tonight, when he broke down, it wasn't just grief over your mother's death. It was the weight of carrying a false identity for 30 years, the exhaustion of never being able to show his son who he really is. Richard finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been living as someone else for so long that I forgot how to be myself. But watching you build your own empire, seeing you succeed on your own terms without needing the Wellington name or connections, you showed me what I should have done all along. The room fell quiet except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Marcus held his mother's letter, understanding now that everything he thought he knew about his family had been built on a foundation of loving deception and protective pretense. Marcus set the letter down carefully, his hands trembling slightly. The silence in the study felt different now, not uncomfortable but heavy with the weight of truth finally spoken. He looked at his father, trying to reconcile the man he thought he knew with Richard Kowalski, the working-class boy from Detroit who had reinvented himself so completely. All those times I felt like I disappointed you, Marcus said slowly. All those moments when I thought you were judging me for not being traditional enough, for starting my own company instead of joining the family business. You were actually proud of me? Richard nodded, tears fresh in his eyes. More proud than you could ever imagine. You did what I never had the courage to do. You stayed true to yourself while still building something magnificent. You never let anyone else's expectations change who you were at your core. Elena moved closer to both men, her role as protector and keeper of family secrets becoming clearer with each revelation. Your father used to talk about you for hours, she said to Marcus. He would read every article about your company, watch every interview you gave, study your business strategies. He was fascinated by your success, but more than that, he was amazed by your authenticity. Then why the distance? Marcus asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Why couldn't you just tell me you were proud? Why did every conversation feel like a business meeting? Richard ran his hands through his graying hair, a gesture that suddenly seemed less formal and more vulnerable than Marcus remembered. Because I didn't know how to be real with you without admitting that everything else about me was fake. How could I praise you for being authentic when I had spent your entire life living a lie? The weight of his father's dilemma began to sink in for Marcus. Richard had painted himself into a corner, trapped between the identity he had created and the relationship he desperately wanted with his son. Your mother understood this, Elena continued, sitting down across from both men. She knew that Richard's love for you was real, even if he couldn't express it naturally. She also knew that someday you would need to understand where you really came from, not just the Wellington side of your heritage. Marcus thought about his mother's letter, particularly the parts he hadn't yet read aloud. "There's more in here, isn't there?" he asked, holding up the pages. "More about our real family history?" Elena nodded. "Your father has relatives he hasn't seen in 20 years, people who loved him before he became Richard Wellington. Your grandmother Kowalski is still alive. She's 87 years old and living in a nursing home in Michigan." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had a grandmother he had never met, extended family he had never known existed, all because his father had been so committed to maintaining his adopted identity that he had severed ties with his past completely. "She thinks I'm dead," Richard said quietly, his voice breaking. "I told my family that I was moving to California to start a new life, and then I just disappeared. I sent money anonymously for years, made sure my mother was taken care of, but I never visited, never called, never let them know that Richard Kowalski still existed somewhere inside Richard Wellington." Marcus felt a surge of anger, not at his father's deception, but at the waste of it all. "Do you realize what you've stolen from all of us? I could have had a grandmother, cousins, real family connections. You could have had the support of people who loved you for who you actually were." "I know," Richard said, his shoulders sagging with the weight of decades of regret. "I told myself I was protecting everyone, that my old family was better off without the complications of my new life, that you were better off with a respectable father than knowing the truth about my background. But really, I was protecting myself from having to face the fear that nobody would accept both versions of me." Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. "I've been carrying this for 5 years, she said, handing it to Marcus. "Your father asked me to hire a private investigator to check on his family. This is your grandmother at her 80th birthday party." Marcus stared at the photo, seeing an elderly woman surrounded by people who shared certain features with his father. The same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes. She was smiling broadly, but there was something wistful in her expression, as if she were missing someone important. "She talks about you all the time," Elena said to Richard. The investigator reported that she tells everyone at the nursing home about her son, who went to California and became successful. She doesn't know the details, but she's proud of what she imagines you've accomplished." Richard took the photograph with shaking hands, staring at his mother's face for a long moment. "She looks so much older," he whispered. "I've missed so much of her life, so many family gatherings, so many chances to be her son instead of just an anonymous benefactor." Marcus felt something shifting inside him, a puzzle piece clicking into place. "This is why you've been so unhappy," he said to his father. "Not just because of Mom's death, but because you've been living as someone else for 30 years. You've been grieving not just her loss, but the loss of your own identity. And it's why he couldn't connect with you the way he wanted to," Elena added. "How do you teach your son about authenticity and following his dreams when you've spent your adult life doing the exact opposite?" The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. His father, who had always seemed like the embodiment of establishment success, had actually been more of a self-made man than Marcus himself. Richard had built his fortune from nothing, using intelligence and determination to rise from poverty to wealth. But unlike Marcus, he had felt compelled to hide his origins and pretend to be something he wasn't. The investigator also found this, Elena said, pulling out a sealed envelope addressed to Richard Kowalski in shaky handwriting. "Your mother writes to you every year on your birthday. She gives the letters to your sister Anna, who keeps them in case you ever come back." Richard stared at the envelope as if it might explode. "She still writes to me?" "Every year for 20 years, Elena confirmed. "Anna wanted to hire investigators to find you, but your mother made her promise not to. She said that if you wanted to come home, you would find your own way back." Marcus watched his father's face crumble as the full impact of his choices became clear. He had a mother who still loved him, siblings who had preserved his memory, and a son who had spent years wishing for a deeper connection. All of it had been within reach, if only he had been brave enough to bridge the gap between Richard Kowalski and Richard Wellington. "It's not too late," Marcus said suddenly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "It's not too late for any of this." The three of them sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, the weight of 20 years of hidden truth settling around them like dust after an earthquake. Marcus could feel something fundamental shifting in his understanding of family, identity, and the courage required to live authentically. What would it look like? Richard asked suddenly, his voice so quiet that Marcus almost didn't hear him. Starting over at 62? Trying to reclaim a life I walked away from decades ago? Elena smiled for the first time that evening, an expression of hope mixed with relief. It would look like honesty, she said simply. It would look like a man finally brave enough to introduce his son to his grandmother. Marcus felt a surge of excitement at the possibility, but also a deep sadness for all the lost years. Do you think she would forgive you? He asked his father. Do you think the family would understand why you disappeared? There's only one way to find out, Elena replied before Richard could answer. She had clearly been thinking about this moment for a long time, preparing for the day when the family's carefully maintained facade would finally crumble, and they would have to decide who they wanted to be going forward. Richard picked up his mother's unopened letter, turning it over in his hands. I've been a coward, he said, the words carrying the weight of a man taking full responsibility for his choices. I was so afraid of being rejected for who I really was that I rejected myself first. I abandoned my family to avoid the possibility that they might abandon me. But you were young, Marcus said, surprising himself by defending his father's decisions. You were trying to build a life to be worthy of Mom and her family's acceptance. Maybe the choices you made weren't perfect, but they came from a place of love and ambition, not malice. Elena nodded approvingly. Your mother always said that Richard's heart was good, even when his decisions were misguided. She knew that everything he did was motivated by his desire to provide for and protect the people he loved. Richard looked at his son with something Marcus had never seen before. Vulnerability mixed with desperate hope. If we do this, if we try to reconnect with my family, it means admitting publicly that everything about the Wellington legacy was built on a lie. It means acknowledging that your grandfather wasn't a shipping magnate, that your heritage isn't what everyone believes it to be. Marcus laughed, a sound that startled both Elena and his father. Do you really think I care about that? Do you think my success depends on having the right bloodline or the proper social connections? Dad, I built my company from my dorm room using borrowed equipment. I've never needed the Wellington name to validate who I am. The relief that washed over Richard's face was profound. For 30 years, he had carried the burden of believing that his deception was necessary to protect his son's future. That revealing the truth would somehow diminish Marcus's prospects or social standing. Besides, Marcus continued, I think I'd rather be the grandson of a hard-working auto worker than the heir to old money I never earned. At least that explains where I get my work ethic and my refusal to accept things just because they've always been done a certain way. Elena clapped her hands together softly, a gesture of pure joy. Your mother would be so proud to hear you say that. She always hoped that someday you and your father would find each other without needing the artificial barriers that wealth and social expectations create. Richard opened his mother's letter with trembling fingers, scanning the contents quickly before looking up with tears in his eyes. She says she dreams about me sometimes, he whispered. She dreams that I come home for Christmas dinner and bring my family with me. She says she prays every night that God will let her live long enough to meet her grandson. The emotional impact of those words hit all three of them simultaneously. Marcus felt tears welling up in his own eyes as he imagined an elderly woman he had never met praying for a meeting that had been postponed by nothing more than fear and pride. We could go, Marcus said suddenly, the idea forming as he spoke. We could drive to Michigan tomorrow. We could show up at the nursing home and introduce ourselves. What's the worst that could happen? Richard looked terrified at the prospect, but also more alive than Marcus had seen him in years. What if she's angry? What if she doesn't want to see me after all this time? What if the family thinks I'm just coming back now because I want something from them? Then we'll deal with that, Marcus said firmly. But what if she's thrilled to see you? What if the family has been hoping for exactly this moment for 20 years? What if your sister Anna has been keeping those letters because she never stopped believing you would come home someday? Elena stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens that had been her domain for so many years. I think, she said carefully, that your mother knew this day would come. I think she asked me to protect that letter and to take care of your father because she understood that eventually the weight of pretending to be someone else would become unbearable. She turned back to face both men. Your mother was the wisest person I ever knew. She saw things that others missed, understood connections that weren't obvious to anyone else. If she believed that you would eventually find your way back to your authentic self, then maybe it's time to trust her judgment. Marcus felt a sense of purpose settling over him, a clarity he hadn't experienced since his mother's death. "I want to meet my grandmother," he said with conviction. "I want to know my cousins and aunts and uncles. I want to understand where I really came from, not the sanitized version of family history that's been presented to me my whole life." Richard stood up slowly, seeming to gather strength from his son's enthusiasm. "It would mean giving up the pretense entirely," he said. "If we do this, there's no going back to the careful fiction we've maintained. Everyone will know that Richard Wellington was an invention, that the family patriarch was really just a scared kid from Detroit who got lucky and worked hard." "Good," Marcus said without hesitation. "Maybe it's time for our family to be known for something real instead of something manufactured. Maybe it's time for us to be proud of what we actually accomplished instead of what we inherited." Elena moved back to the desk and pulled out a small address book, worn from years of use. "I've been keeping track of your family," she admitted to Richard. "Addresses, phone numbers, important dates. I always believed that someday you would want this information." As she handed the book to Richard, Marcus realized that Elena had been preparing for this moment for 15 years, carefully maintaining connections that his father had been too afraid to preserve himself. She had been not just a maid or even a friend, but a guardian of possibilities, keeping doors open that Richard had tried to close forever. 2 weeks later, Marcus found himself driving a rental car through the streets of Detroit with his father in the passenger seat and Elena in the back. They had spent those weeks planning the trip, researching the family members they were about to meet, and most importantly, allowing Richard to slowly shed the rigid persona he had maintained for decades. The change in his father had been remarkable to witness. As Richard allowed himself to remember his childhood, to speak with the slight accent he had trained himself to suppress, to talk about his parents and siblings with genuine emotion, he seemed to become more solid, more real. The formal, distant businessman was giving way to someone warmer and more accessible. "That's the house where I grew up," Richard said quietly, as they drove through a working-class neighborhood. The small frame house looked tired but well-maintained, with a tiny front yard and a chain-link fence. It was a world away from the Wellington estate, but Marcus could see the pride in his father's eyes as he pointed out the porch where his mother used to sit in the evenings. "It's smaller than I imagined," Marcus said, not meaning it as a criticism, but simply absorbing the reality of his father's origins. "But I can see why you have such strong memories of it. It looks like a place where a family could be happy." Elena leaned forward from the back seat. "Your father described every room of that house to me over the years," she said. He remembered which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck, how the kitchen smelled when his mother was cooking Sunday dinner. He never stopped loving this place, even when he convinced himself he had to leave it behind. They continued driving toward Sunny Acres Nursing Home, where Richard's mother had lived for the past 5 years. Marcus could feel the tension radiating from his father as they got closer to their destination. After 30 years of separation, the next few hours would determine whether the family bonds could be repaired or if too much time had passed for healing. "What if she doesn't recognize me?" Richard asked for the 10th time that morning. "What if the Alzheimer's has progressed since the investigator's last report? What if I've waited too long?" Marcus pulled into the parking lot of Sunny Acres and turned off the engine. "Then we'll love her anyway," he said simply. "And maybe somewhere deep inside she'll recognize something familiar about her son coming home." The nursing home was clean and cheerful, with flowers in the lobby and staff members who greeted visitors warmly. Marcus had called ahead to speak with Anna, Richard's sister, who had been speechless with joy when she learned that her brother was finally ready to come home. Anna was waiting for them in the lobby, a woman in her late 50s with Richard's same intelligent eyes and determined jawline. When she saw Richard walk through the front doors, she burst into tears and ran toward him without hesitation. "Richie," she sobbed, using the childhood nickname that no one had spoken in 30 years. "Oh my God, Richie, you came home." The reunion between brother and sister was overwhelming to witness. Marcus watched his father transform before his eyes, dropping the last vestiges of the formal Wellington persona as he held his sister and apologized over and over for disappearing from their lives. "We never stopped hoping," Anna said through her tears. "Mom always said you would come back when you were ready. She said you were too good a son to stay away forever. Elena stood quietly beside Marcus, tears streaming down her face as she watched the family reunion she had helped orchestrate. Marcus put his arm around her shoulders, understanding now that she had been not just his father's caretaker, but the guardian of his family's future. Is she having a good day? Richard asked anxiously, referring to their mother's mental state. Will she understand who I am? Anna nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue. She's been more alert this week than she's been in months. It's like she somehow knew something important was about to happen. And Richie, she kept your room exactly the way you left it until she moved in here. She saved everything. Your high school trophies, your college acceptance letter, even that awful senior picture you hated. They walked down the hallway together, Anna pointing out family photos that lined the walls of her mother's room. Marcus saw pictures of cousins he had never met, family gatherings he had never attended, milestones and celebrations that had happened without his father's presence but never without his memory. Before we go in, Anna said, stopping outside their mother's door, I need you to know that she talks about you every day. She tells the other residents about her son who moved to California and became successful. She's never stopped being proud of you, even though she didn't understand why you couldn't come home. Richard took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders in a gesture that reminded Marcus of the businessman he had always known. But when he spoke, his voice carried warmth and vulnerability that the Wellington facade had never allowed. I was afraid, he admitted to his sister. I was afraid that I had changed too much, that I wouldn't fit into the family anymore. I was afraid that you would all see me as a stranger pretending to be someone I used to be. You're still our Richie, Anna said firmly. Success and money and fancy houses don't change the heart of a person. Mom always said that, and she was right. Anna opened the door to their mother's room, revealing an elderly woman sitting in a wheelchair by the window, looking out at the garden. When she heard the door open, she turned with the careful movements of someone whose body has grown frail, but whose mind remains sharp. Anna, dear, you brought visitors, she said in a voice that was softer than Marcus had expected, but still carried traces of the strength that had raised 5 children as a single mother after her husband's death. Richard stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly as he approached his mother for the first time in 3 decades. Hello, Mom, he said quietly. It's me. It's Richard. The elderly woman studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus held his breath, wondering if she would recognize the son who had disappeared so completely from her life. Then her face lit up with a joy so pure and overwhelming that everyone in the room began crying. My Richie, she whispered, reaching out with trembling hands to touch his face. My beautiful boy, you came home to your mama. As Richard knelt beside his mother's wheelchair and allowed her to hold him, Marcus understood that he was witnessing more than just a family reunion. He was seeing his father reclaim his authentic self, embracing the identity he had abandoned in pursuit of a life he thought he needed to live. And this must be my grandson, his grandmother said, looking at Marcus with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and love. Anna told me you were coming. She said you're as handsome as your father was at your age and just as smart. Marcus approached his grandmother with wonder, seeing in her face the genetic inheritance he had never known existed. When she took his hands in hers, he felt connected to a history and a family legacy that was real in ways the Wellington name had never been. I've been waiting to meet you for 30 years, she said to Marcus. I've been praying that someday I would get to see what kind of man my Richie's son became. Over the next several hours, 3 generations of family shared stories, looked through photo albums, and began the process of weaving Marcus into the fabric of relatives he had never known existed. His grandmother was sharp and funny, full of stories about Richard's childhood that revealed a boy who was curious, ambitious, and deeply loved by his family. As the day wore on, Marcus realized that his father's greatest fear, that his family would reject him for the choices he had made, had been completely unfounded. The Kowalski family welcomed Richard home without judgment, focusing not on the years he had been absent but on the joy of having him back in their lives. Elena sat quietly in the corner of the room, watching the reunion she had helped make possible. When Marcus caught her eye, she smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had kept a promise to a dying woman and seen it fulfilled beyond her wildest hopes. That evening, as they drove back to their hotel, Richard seemed like a completely different person than the man Marcus had discovered crying in Elena's arms just 2 weeks earlier. The weight of pretense had lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the lightness that comes from finally being authentic. "Your mother would be so happy," Elena said from the back seat. She always believed that family love was stronger than fear. That truth was more powerful than the stories we tell ourselves to avoid difficult conversations. Marcus looked at his father, seeing not the distant businessman who had raised him, but Richard Kowalski, a man who had worked hard, loved deeply, and finally found the courage to come home. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Where do we go from here?" Richard smiled, and for the first time in Marcus's memory, it was a completely genuine expression, free of the careful control that had characterized their relationship for so many years. "Now we build something real," he said. "A family that's based on truth instead of pretense, love instead of obligation, connection instead of distance." As they drove through the Michigan countryside, heading back toward California with plans to return soon and often, Marcus understood that finding his father weeping in Elena's embrace had been the beginning of the most important journey of their lives. The journey home to who they really were, and who they could be together as a family, finally free from the weight of living a lie.